The Beorning class in the Lord of the Rings Online has always felt incomplete to me ever since its release almost 9 years ago. While the class has received 2 major revamps since then, every time I play my Beorning, it just feels like an unfinished and very unrefined class. In fact, 4 years ago, I made a video titled The Redline Beorning Problem, focusing specifically on that DPS spec, which in theory should be one of my favorites in the entire game, yet because of the issues it has, I just have never really enjoyed it. And 2 years after that, I revisited the problem, and unfortunately, not much changed in that span. And here we are 2 years after that, and in a recent video, I actually called the Redline Beorning my least favorite spec in the entire game. And in today's video, the plan was to talk about why that is and what the Redline Beorning problem is and where it stands today. But the LOTRO team, Standing Stone Games, has interrupted this with some news on the Update 37 Beorning Revamp. So I am quite excited to dive into this. I haven't gotten into all the details, but I have skimmed some of this stuff, and there are a lot of interesting changes to all 3 specs: Blue Line, Red Line, which I really harp on a lot, and Yellow Line, which is the one I play the least. Blue Line's probably my favorite right now, but I scroll all the way to the bottom to highlight this. General changes: Claw Swipe is now a general attack skill accessible to all Beornings. This is, while it's at the bottom here, a very great start to the Beorning revamp that they are doing in Update 37. This is something that in all these previous videos that I have talked about, and even during a lot of streams where the Beorning comes up, one of the things that I mentioned just should be a part of the class as a whole is Claw Swipe. It's a perfect example of an ability, so that is a great start, but let's dive a little bit into the more details here. So Myth is a relatively new developer. I believe we've heard from them a couple times before, but they are working on the Beorning refresh, as they're calling it, for Update 37, but to me, it looks like it could qualify as a revamp. Anyway, they have a list of notes here for goals, 6 goals to keep in mind with the refresh. So first off, they're going to be a little bit more specific about how much time you spend in bear form versus man form, and then rebalance a couple things like Armor Crush and Debilitating Bees here, so they're a bit less dominant. Fortunately, I have this game up here, so we can actually look at those, and in the Yellow Line, Debilitating Bees is very valuable, especially in group content, because it's a huge physical mitigation debuff up to 12%, which, with a lot of the primary DPS classes right now being physical with the Hunter, Champion, etc., this is of course very valuable for them. In fact, despite my Redline build here being more actually Redline DPS build, a lot of people who spec into a Redline Beorning fill actually the support role by getting that specific trait in the yellow tree and also a specific trait in the blue tree, which I do have, which is Armor Crush, which is not just a mitigation debuff, but with 3 ranks here, Armor Crush is a 15% incoming damage debuff, and this one has somewhat close to 60% uptime. So at endgame, a lot of the Redline builds are actually more of hybrid Blue Line, Yellow Line, and Redline builds, where you get the good DPS stuff in the Redline, but also the support stuff in the yellow and a little bit in the Blue Line. And this really just scratches the surface of what, in my opinion, makes up the Redline Beorning problem, but let's go ahead and continue with the notes. And then it looks like this is the type of thing that I think really makes it feel like the Beorning is unpolished when they have just very generic names for their traits. So having something more thematic, it doesn't really actually impact how you play them, but I think that's a good thing moving forward. And then Blue Line Beorning, while it's actually my favorite spec to play, and I love tanking on the Blue Line Beorning, one of the weaknesses that I often highlight when I do play it is that they just aren't really up to par with other tanks, especially in terms of emergency cooldowns, which is actually the Beorning Revamp, one of the areas they were greatly improved. So while I do enjoy the Blue Line Beorning, it would be dishonest to say that they couldn't actually use some work, and I think that is great to see they're looking at tools for them. And then they're looking for number 5 here to fix Execute and give Redline more tools in general. I'm honestly a little bit more interested in their more tools in general, but it is also true Execute is a huge problem. It's an entirely wasted trait branch here with first getting Execute, and then I honestly forget these because they're all useless, with Final Strike here and Moment of Opportunity. So before the most recent bigger Beorning revamp, these had a little bit of niche use, but they still weren't the most impactful, and now they're just basically completely useless because Execute goes contrary to the entire purpose of the Redline Beorning gameplay, at least right now, which I think almost highlights the bigger problem. Is this set bonus here, Wrathful. So you are actually motivated to stay at maximum wrath while playing the Redline Beorning, and you get a huge crit chance, 15% crit chance if you maintain 100 wrath, which is very impactful. And Execute goes completely against that by consuming all your wrath, and it just doesn't even really do all that much anyway. So kind of ironically, Execute, you actively lose DPS. And then finally, the spec that I play the least, they are looking to make Yellowline a more robust healer that performs well in fellowships and raids. If I remember correctly, right now Yellow Beorning perhaps shines a little bit more in the raid scenario, with a lot of their heals not being fellowship specific like a lot of other classes, so we'll see what they have in store with them. Now I do want to highlight, just because I play Yellowline Beorning less doesn't mean I'm necessarily not interested in the changes that they have and wouldn't be interested in playing it. It's just a spec that I haven't had the opportunity to maybe play as much as the other ones, and generally if I am playing Beorning, I'd rather do tanking or DPS. And honestly, I don't know, the past couple years I just haven't wanted to heal as much. Again, I think it's partially just because the opportunities haven't presented themselves. But anyway, let's get into this because I am super excited, and first off we'll just see how long they want you to spend in bear form versus man form. And immediately what I'm seeing is with the yellow line, they'll want you to switch every 30 seconds or so, switch from bear to man specifically. I'm kind of curious at this point, they don't really highlight the difference in time that you spend between them. So like with red line, switch bear to man every 45 to 90 seconds, that is actually a huge range. But I'm kind of curious, do they expect you to just be in man form for like 2 minutes with each of these, or how much time do they actually anticipate you spending in man form? Or maybe for both of these you spend about half the time in bear and half the time in man. I think a little bit more of an idea of like just over say 10 minutes, that's a very long duration, but what percentage of that would you be expected to be in man versus bear form for at least somewhat optimal gameplay? Either way, the idea that I'm getting from this is yellow line you'll spend the least time in bear form, red line a moderate amount of time in bear form, and blue line pretty much stay in bear form in group settings as a tank. So they do highlight that this is specifically a target for group content and maybe will be a little bit different depending how you play landscape. And I think it is good to just note that each line can still change at will depending on the scenario, and maybe there are certain situations where you'd be swapping frequently or less frequently depending on the context of your gameplay. But anyway, another thing they are looking at is skills that perhaps don't really work with its core identity. So something like guarded attack for the blue line Beorning, you can actually only use that in man form, even though it gives you actually a defensive buff. Because blue line Beornings want to stay in bear form, you don't really use that all that frequently because you lose a lot of your defenses when you're outside of bear form. So they're looking at examples like that, it looks like, to change, so this one would be made into bear form only. And again, from my experience playing a tank, while I enjoy it, I think that would be a great addition. Now it looks like for Armor Crush and Debilitating Bees, I'm really curious what they are planning to make these less dominant. So for Armor Crush, it looks like just one row deeper, so you have a little bit more limited in your ability to take that. It's also going to be reduced and will give less incoming damage, so the debuff is being nerfed essentially. Now for the Debilitating Bees, that is being moved shallower into the yellow line, actually in the first row, and then that's going to be a part of broader changes in classes to allow more trait lines access to some mitigation debuffs. Okay, so this is actually something that is going to be made more accessible. So for example, with my build here, I'm like level, what am I? 129 on this Beorning, and with my particular more DPS oriented build, I might actually be able to get that without sacrificing a bunch of stuff, either in the blue line with Armor Crush or in the red line with more DPS oriented stuff to be able to easily get Debilitating Bees. It also looks like they're nerfing its mitigation debuff as well. And I think that's a good way to make Beornings less reliant on that. Hopefully they balance other classes and group content around that weaker debuff, especially as we move into the expansion. Maybe balance will be a bit odd with the end of the level 140 cap here, but I really hope they're focusing more so on the expansion to make the expansion experience as good as possible when we get that later this year. And then this we already covered a little bit just with the thematic trait names instead of generic ones. Again, this won't really impact gameplay, but it'll just be a little bit more thematic. Fatality increase becomes nature's bounty, and a lot of different things like the mitigation increases have hide reference, crit chance just change to quick claws, all sorts of things like that. Honestly, that's just something that makes it more exciting to pick the traits again, even if it doesn't actually impact your gameplay. And now we are moving to the blue line. So it looks like a lot of the traits with guarded attack, down but not out, oppressing presence, etc. are being reworked to make them more relevant in bear form. So man form, only weakening blow, that will be moved to red line. It looks like weakening blow here, just as a reminder, increases the damage of slam, which always made more sense I think for the red line, except for the debuff portion of it, decreasing enemy outgoing damage. Curious to see what will happen with that debuff. And then it looks like for avoiding and countering damage, we'll get some new passive traits, which I think, you know, we'll have to see how that works out in beta with more details. But also with Rake, this is where we get the note of Claw Swipe becoming available to all trait lines. So this is going to be replaced, and actually Rake, it looks like, will be converted to the red line. And Rake is here where it gives a bleed to Claw Swipe. I actually forgot that was not just a part of the baseline ability because I'm so used to having that bleed from the blue line. But the big thing with Claw Swipe is it does decrease enemy outgoing damage a little bit, but it's really just a solid short cooldown AoE that blue line Beornings have access to, and it looks like very excitingly red line and yellow line Beornings will have access to in the near future. I'm kind of curious if they might add some healing component to the yellow line. That sounds pretty fun to me. If that were the case, and perhaps for blue line Beorning it could give some sort of maybe a debuff like it has with decreasing enemy damage. It's kind of like that Gallant Display for the captains. If they make it have a unique effect for each spec, I think that actually sounds like a great idea for that. Maybe we'll read a little bit more on that. So it looks like Animalistic at the bottom of the set bonus will be moved up to where Rake was, but Cultivate is a new one that increases your physical and tactical mitigation and reduces incoming damage. Oh, while you're maintaining certain wrath thresholds, so you'll be a little bit more defensive basically when you have higher wrath. That's kind of interesting. And that also really does motivate you to stay in bear form and high wrath. And alright, so far I like a lot of this stuff here, but I'm really excited to actually dive into the details with how they plan to fix Execute and give Redline more tools in general. So, Execute, as currently constructed, yes, it does have some issues. Too weak and too punishing. Yes, I think I mentioned earlier, it actively decreases your damage by using it, which is kind of crazy. But they are going to have it lead to Moment of Opportunity. So when you use Execute, you'll get Moment of Opportunity, which will unlock 2 finishing abilities. So it's kind of like, I don't know, for some frame of reference, the parry chain from Guardians, where you use your parry opener and then you get additional abilities opened from that. It sounds like that kind of idea with Execute unlocking that. But anyway, you'll get Savage, Knockdown, and Final Strike. So all of these will, actually all of them, will consume all of your wrath, so you're going to have to build up the wrath for that. Hopefully they change, we'll see, but hopefully they'll change that capstone trait for the red line here with Wrathful with that, or at least make them worth using still. But anyway, Execute opens those 2, and Savage Knockdown is a defensive AoE attack that stuns a group of enemies and gives you time to regroup, while Final Strike will be an offensive AoE attack. Great to see these be AoEs. That's one of the things that I've talked about in some of the previous videos with the Redline Beorning, where it just feels a bit odd. And then Execute, I think it's good to note, will be a powerful offensive single target attack that hopefully is actually worth using. So now it looks like the core idea with the Redline Beorning will be to build up Wrath and then unleash these powerful attacks to drain Wrath before doing it again. That's exactly what I've always felt like the Redline Beorning should be, instead of basically how it is played right now. And, oh, they actually do highlight Wrathful here, that's going to be reworked to better support this new mode of play as well. Man, compared to the other Beorning revamps that I mentioned at the beginning of this video, this one actually just sounds on paper so much better than the previous ones already. Even if we don't have it in beta, I already feel a lot more optimistic that this will actually be a great thing for the class, at least so far the red and blue line. As far as more tools go for the Redline Beornings, we have Enraging Sacrifice, Turn the Tides, and Crippling Sting. What you will notice is that with those 3, I believe, I don't have Enraging Sacrifice because that just doesn't have the most uses as a DPS spec. And then Turn the Tides, you basically pick 1 point, so your corruption removal now removes 3 corruptions. The damage on that does not matter at all. And then Crippling Stings reduces the run speed of enemies. Of course, that can have an impact, I'd say more so in PvMP situations than PvE content, but I never pick that as well. So it looks like they aren't 100% decided on where those are going, but they have decided they're doing something. They're removing them, reducing them, or buffing them. They're also adding really like this new attack skills, so Nature's Wrath and Trample. Guessing they'll have details on these at some point, but they're also giving something, Redline, just something more thematic to tie it together, so they're introducing Blood Prize. This is a trait and skill that gives Beorning increased damage on all bleeds, so maybe they're giving them a little bit more emphasis on their bleeds. And then it looks like Call to Wild is focused more on damage and less on Wrath economy, as they're calling it, so Call to Wild currently gives you pretty sizable melee damage increase at 30%, but also has a good focus on Wrath with just increasing your Wrath generation, really. And you know, at least compared to the current Redline Beorning that we have, I think this statement of just these changes to make Red Beorning reinvigorated, so as you build Wrath, you ready your damage buffing abilities, and then you unleash huge finishers on your foes. I think I'll really have to actually get a feel of the gameplay whenever this comes to beta and is eventually released to have a really solid idea if I like that kind of more specific place that they are taking these spec, but at the very least, I think it will be a ton better than what we have right now. Again, so far, 2 out of 3 specs I'm very excited about, but Yellow Line Beorning is the one I have played the least, but I'll still cover it here. So it looks like Beorning healers, I did actually remember correctly, are good in raids but fall behind a bit in fellowships. So they're actually removing raid-wide healing from Relentless Maul and rejuvenating Bellow. I could see that being a bit unpopular because I know people really like that raid-wide healing aspect of even those specific 2 abilities. But it looks like because they have to balance them around being raid-wide heals, they're just not going to be as strong for 3-man and 6-man content. So yeah, the magnitude of healing is lower, so they're changing them actually to fellowship only. I wonder if this is a direction they're planning to take all the healers in the game, because if I remember correctly, there are a couple things maybe the Runekeeper still has, but didn't they change some of the minstrel stuff to be specifically fellowship wide? And I think the Blue Line Captain with the revamp is a lot fellowship specific as well. If you play the healers more frequently than I do, you can let me know if that actually is the case and if that looks like the direction they are trying to take all the healers to be more fellowship wide instead of raid wide. That would definitely be appreciated. So it looks like on top of those general changes to more fellowships focus instead of raid focus, they are adding some new tools for the Yellow Beorning as well. So 2 new healing skills. It looks like To Your Aid is a long cooldown single target heal. I wonder how long cooldown, if it's like a massive 3-minute cooldown heal or if that's like 30 seconds, 1 minute. I guess we'll have to see later. And then it looks like that will also buff the target with Mark of Grimbeorn. And the Nature Salve is going to be a bear form long cooldown AoE fellowship heal. Kind of curious also the cooldown on that, but that's actually going to be short range, which I kind of like that idea. Personally, to me, it seems fitting for a Beorning healer. So it looks like, even with it being a long cooldown, there's going to be a tier up effect. So every time you use the skill, it will tier up to 6 total possible tiers. I'm kind of curious how that would work with a long cooldown, because when I first think of long cooldown, my mind jumps to like 3-minute cooldown, 1.5-minute cooldown, even 30-second cooldown actually seems like a really long cooldown for a tier up type heal. But it looks like the cooldowns, I'll actually do mention it here, will support the 25 to 30 second transition between man and bear form here. And then it looks like this is kind of the idea I get when I get into very basic Yellow Line gameplay that I do. You do fast transitions between man and bear form depending on the situation and what it calls here. So for an optimal healing, efficient healing rotation, it looks like you will want to transition about 25 to 30 seconds after this revamp. And then it looks like, I'm guessing this is true for all specs, but they're also going to have new traceries to support. They at least mention here yellow and red line. Wouldn't mind seeing that for Beorning, or at least a good refresh look at those. So it looks like the other specs, a lot of the traits are having a little bit of a rework as well to make some of the options more appealing and make space for new healing skills. And then it looks like they're looking at making small quality of life changes, so Wanderlust will be upgradable in the first row of Yellow Line to 78% movement speed. That would be insane. Right now it's the fastest out of combat run speed boost, of course outside of mount, at 62%, but moving it to 78% would actually move it in line with Journeyman riding mounts. So you actually, right now on my Beorning, I actually would want to go on my mount, even though Wanderlust is kind of close, it's just not as fast. Well, Outside of the Worsted, that means Wanderlust would be just as fast as a mount, and if you don't even have Journeyman riding or these very fast mounts, it could be even faster. So that's actually, that would be a huge quality of life change. I'm not sure about small. I wonder any other quality of life changes they're looking at, or like being able to do more stuff in bear form and perhaps have the game automatically transition you out if it's technically even possible. Hopefully they're at least looking into it. And it looks like towards the bottom here we have specific changes with the red, blue, and yellow line. Again, I want to highlight maybe general changes first. Again, claw swipe being accessible to all specs, absolutely love that. And then for traceries, these are a few that they are looking at adding for the red line, and I don't see any for the blue line actually, but for the yellow line, a couple as well. So moving into more details, starting with the blue line here, we already covered a little bit with guarded attack become an any form attack, and then some changes from assertive roar now buffing rush instead of ferocious roar, and then down but not out is an effect when you go below 30% morale to give you some mitigation and wrath if you are in bear form. And then they are making some changes to counter. So counter currently is about half, yes, I just looked at this, about a half uptime cooldown ability, so 40-second cooldown that gives you a dodging reactive state. So during this time, during counter, if you do evade an attack, you have 10% increased evade chance. You can unlock the ability counter attack, which does some moderate damage, but it's not the most impactful thing overall if we're being honest. So it looks like they are giving a dancing bear trait to increase the chance for counter to trigger. Actually, I don't know if this will change the counter cooldown ability there, or if they're potentially just making it more of a passive thing. But when counter does trigger, they're adding counter swipe. So when you parry, you'll gain a crit chance bonus, and when you evade, you get a crit strike bonus. And then they're doing a shuffling with a couple of the traits here with Rending Blow, Armor Crush, as well as Recuperate and Quick Recovery, the healing ones being moved earlier, where you saw the nerf and the numbers could always be modified to Armor Crush. And then it looks like Opposing Presence. This one's going to be one that increases the damage of Claw Swipe, and the max rank will cause Claw Swipe to Force Taunt for a short duration, but it does increase the cooldown of Claw Swipe. I believe that's the same thing here as Opposing Presence, yes, Biting Edge. But now it will be for Claw Swipe instead, which is again the bear form AoE that Beornings will have. And then I believe we have already covered pretty much everything else here. So moving on to the red line, they're removing any advantage trait, adding new trait and skill Nature's Wrath. So Nature's Wrath eventually can increase the damage of that. So in bear form, it will give you 10% wrath. It's a bear form ability. And then Trample is an attack in bear form as well that will lower the target's BPE and crit defense. Also gives you a little bit of wrath. Additional ranks increase the debuff to increase the debuff magnitude, really. And then Crippling Stings, this will go to 3 ranks instead of 5, and now Beast Swarm actually will do bleed damage, I'm guessing on top of the light dot. That sounds pretty fun. But each rank will increase the damage of that bleed. This is the great type of thing, I think, for the red line to actually make it feel more like a proper red line DPS spec. So instead of the run speed debuff, it will actually play to your theme with some bleed damage. And then bleed damage trait will apply to all bleeds instead of just slash. I think that makes sense, definitely. Turn the Tides will have 1 rank down from 5. As I mentioned, it's useless to put 5 points in that, and 1 is almost like the only reason I'd consider it an auto pick is you have absolutely nothing else that's actually useful before that. At least don't have anything really worth picking, I should say. And then Serrated Edge will make Biting Edge become a single attack but with a bleed over 4 seconds, and then increased strengths on that will increase the damage and the bleed duration. So it's a little bit more of just a consistent trait as you rank it up. Now as for Execute, they do have a little bit more details here with how it will look in the trait tree, as well as getting Final Strike and Savage Knockdown. I think we get the general idea that as you pick Execute, eventually you can unlock the Savage Knockdown and eventually Final Strike, but actually visualizing that in the trait tree I think would make a lot more sense when we do get that. So it looks like Composure, the big self-heal effect that you can get in the red line, will be changed to just 3 ranks, so you don't have to spend as many trait points in it. You'll also get Weakening Blows from the blue line put into the red line, and now Blood Prize will be one of the new traits. So this one just this one is an ability, that's right. And each rank gives 20% increased damage of all bleeds, 20-second buff off and 90-second cooldown. Quite the long cooldown, but it's a cooldown ability, and you can get 5 ranks in that. They're also removing Festering Wound set trait here, and it's being replaced with the Blue Line set trait for Break, which again gave it bleed damage. Call to Wild being reworked, so now it just gives a damage boost for 20 seconds, 1 minute cooldown in man form. And then this one is actually reading very oddly, but at 0 Wrath, you get plus 15% crit chance. So actually, as your Wrath goes up, you get reduced crit chance, and it looks like you get 0% crit chance at 100 Wrath. Now, what's kind of confusing here is at 75 to 80 Wrath, you get 15% crit chance as well. So there seems to be this little tiny mark here. If you can maintain 75 to 79 Wrath, you could actually have like 18% crit chance is how this is reading. I'm not sure that's quite intended. Perhaps what they're trying to mean here is at 0 Wrath, you do have 15% crit chance, and going up to perhaps 75 Wrath, which is the threshold to use these new Wrath consumers, is you would get reduced crit chance, but once you're at that threshold, maybe it goes back to 15% crit chance is really what they're trying to get at here. I don't know if it actually does play like just as it's written here. I don't know if it sounds fun to try to stay at that very specific Wrath target for, I guess that would actually be 21% crit chance. But anyway, we'll move on from that and see how it actually works out in game again when it's added. And then we are actually at the yellow line, so already covered Wanderlust. You get 2 ranks for 78% speed, which is quite crazy. And yeah, I think we covered most of the yellow line stuff, but they do say that Stampede will have 3 ranks instead of 5, but the same effect. Imposing Presence, 2 ranks, and Crippling Roar will have 1 rank. All these, again, have the same effect. So that's, again, the type of thing that can free them up for more healing-specific traits. So overall, this is looking, I think, just a lot more promising than previous Beorning revamps. And just one of my big hopes as I am playing the red line here is that it actually becomes a fun DPS spec that I look forward to playing, actually look forward to putting my trait points in the different traits and not just filling it out really just to fill it out. And also with the, say, blue line Beorning could just become a little bit more viable from the tanking end of things. And then for yellow line Beorning, again, don't play that one all that much, but you know, perhaps some of the changes could just make it interesting enough that I actually do try to. It could motivate me to try to play it more when the opportunity presents itself for me. I also really hope, random note, that Relentless, unfortunately when you switch forms, the visuals of that kind of gets bugged and you don't even see it on cooldown anymore, so changing Maul to actually have that would be a huge quality of life boost. I also, as a perhaps final note, find it kind of odd that they didn't mention Maul at all, especially in the context of specifically here the red line changes. I wonder if they're planning on doing anything to the good old Ferocious or Maul cooldown, which I can't actually do because even though it doesn't look like it, it's on cooldown right now. Still, unlike the Beorning's channeled ability that I forget the name, Pummel, maybe at least Maul actually has a good effect during the channel. It's kind of an exciting ability in those terms. Anyway, I hope you all did enjoy this video and learn something useful about the Beorning. It is true this pushed back my Lore Master video a little bit more, but I thought it was worth it for this very exciting details on the Beorning revamp. If you did enjoy, don't forget to like and subscribe, and thanks for watching everyone.